Welcome back. If you've been following along, by now you probably feel like you could identify 20 shades of urine in your sleep. But let's step away from the polite rituals and the royal flasks and drift into the quieter, messier, and occasionally ridiculous side of medieval medicine. Because, of course, even the most confident doctor sometimes got it spectacularly wrong. When doctors failed, despite the matula's, charts, and careful readings, doctors failed a lot. Sometimes spectacularly so. Take the case of a 14th century nobleman in northern Italy. He complained of fatigue, and his physician, after careful examination of the urine and an inspiring swirl and sniff ritual, declared he suffered from excess black bile. The treatment: fasting, purging, and several bloodlettings. Spoiler alert, the man actually had malaria, which naturally didn't respond well to herbs or leeches. Failures like this were common. Humans are complicated. Urine isn't magic, and yet doctors persisted, partly because their training insisted it worked, and partly because admitting error could be career-ending. Charlatans versus trained physicians. Not all practitioners were trained in universities. The streets were full of wandering healers, sometimes called piss prophets, who offered their own urine interpretations for a fee. Unlike the educated doctors, these charlatans didn't care about humors or astrology. They were showmen. They might wave a flask dramatically, whisper that the stars dictated your health, offer a potion of suspicious color and taste. Sometimes charlatans got lucky. A patient might feel better after some gentle advice, herbal tea, or just the placebo effect. Meanwhile, the trained physician looked on in dismay, their reputation occasionally damaged because someone without a Latin degree cured the Duke's stomachache. It's a little funny in hindsight, though probably less funny at the time when someone got seriously ill. Epic misdiagnoses. Medieval records are full of minor tragedies. A French princess once suffered from what we now recognize as appendicitis. Her physician, after examining urine and consulting the stars, prescribed cooling herbs and a mild purge. She did not survive. In England, a court physician misread a queen's cloudy urine and insisted she had a fever. He applied leeches liberally. The patient recovered anyway, but the court murmured about incompetence. In Germany, a physician diagnosed melancholy in a young nobleman based solely on the color of his urine. The treatment: a strict regimen of cold baths and purges. The young man became more melancholic, which the doctor chalked up to delicate humors. In short, sometimes the method failed spectacularly. But the ritual continued: swirl, sniff, prescribe. Confidence rarely faltered. Money, reputation, and the dark side. Doctors' livelihoods depended on both skill and perception. Even a single misdiagnosis could ruin a career, especially for those serving the wealthy or royal courts. There are documented cases of physicians being dismissed, fined, or quietly exiled because a matula reading went wrong. In extreme instances, doctors were scapegoated for deaths caused by illness they couldn't control. It was stressful, and yet many persisted. After all, the alternative was obscurity, or worse, working the streets alongside charlatans. Absurd remedies in the face of tragedy. When a patient didn't improve, doctors sometimes doubled down, often in strange ways. Animal parts. Some treatments involved powdered animal bones, fat, or even liver. Magical interventions. Charms, prayers, or recitations alongside herbal remedies. Dietary extremes. Weeks without food, or diets made almost entirely of one type of food. There was also the occasional combination of these approaches. Imagine fasting while wearing a charm and rubbing powdered owl liver on your arms. It didn't necessarily help, but at least it was thorough. Public perception of medicine. Despite failures, doctors were generally respected. Why? Because their rituals looked scientific. People trusted the elaborate procedures, even if they were ineffective. The matula was visible proof of diagnosis. The swirls, sediments, and colors provided something tangible to hold onto in an uncertain world. Even when patients died, families often consoled themselves. He was in good hands. The doctor observed the humors carefully. It is God's will. It was a comforting narrative, even if it had nothing to do with actual medicine. Famous scandals involving physicians. There are a few notable scandals worth floating by. The Duke of Milan's physician, accused of misdiagnosing the Duke's recurring fever for years. The remedy: bloodletting, purges, and cold baths. The Duke eventually recovered after the physician was dismissed. Royal English Court in the 1500s. A queen's pregnancy complications were blamed on a physician who allegedly misread her urine. Gossip spread that he was more concerned with ceremony than science. French nobles. Some physicians were dismissed after misinterpreting urine in a smallpox outbreak, even though the disease was untreatable. In each case, the physician's public image mattered as much as medical skill. And the matula remained a central character, whether deserved or not. P in the culture of fear. Plague, smallpox, and fevers created a culture of uncertainty. Doctors used urine to provide reassurance. Even if their methods were flawed, they gave patients something to hold on to, a ritual, a diagnosis, a sense of predictability. Sometimes this led to bizarre consequences. People submitting multiple samples per day. Families keeping journals of urine color for weeks. Entire communities following a doctor's advice purely based on urine analysis. It was a slow, quiet obsession that dominated daily life for centuries. Humor and tragedy intertwined. What's fascinating is how humor and tragedy coexisted in this world. Humor, satirical poems mocking overconfident doctors, caricatures with exaggerated flasks, and jokes about tasting urine. Tragedy, patients misdiagnosed, ineffective treatments, and generational reliance on flawed practices. This duality created a culture that was, in a sense, resilient. People endured disease, ritual, and odd remedies with a mix of hope and resignation. When science finally caught up, by the 17th century, scientific methods began replacing uroscopy. Microscopes revealed bacteria and parasites. Chemical analysis allowed for precise detection of sugar, proteins, and other markers in urine. Anatomy and circulation studies provided real understanding of the body. Gradually, the reliance on the matula waned. Doctors still used it occasionally, but the ritualistic importance declined. Yet even as science advanced, the cultural memory persisted. Art, satire, and anecdotes kept the image of the medieval physician with a jar alive. The quiet end of an era. By the 18th century, uroscopy became largely ceremonial or decorative. Physicians still respected the tradition, but practical medicine had moved on. The jars collected dust. The careful swirling and sniffing became historical curiosity, and doctors focused on laboratory analysis rather than mystical observation. Yet in a strange way, the obsession left a lasting mark. It taught patience and observation. It codified early medical education. It created a cultural narrative of authority, ritual, and the human desire to understand illness. All from a humble jar of yellow liquid. Closing thoughts for part 5. So if you've been floating along, you now understand. Medieval medicine was equal parts ritual, performance, and earnest attempt. It was beautiful, tragic, absurd, and sometimes mildly horrifying. Failures and scandals were constant companions, yet the matula remained central, a symbol of knowledge, authority, and the persistent human hope that understanding is possible. In part 6, we'll drift into the final reflections. How science replaced ritual, the legacy of uroscopy, and why centuries of obsession with urine quietly shaped modern medicine. Because eventually, even jars of pee must retire. Welcome back, for what is likely the final stretch of our long, gentle journey. By now, you've imagined countless flasks, swirls of yellow liquid, and the quiet rituals of doctors from centuries past. But even the longest tradition eventually gives way to change. Let's float through the final chapter of medieval uroscopy and see what remains in its wake. The dawn of scientific observation. By the late 17th century, things began to shift. Doctors started using microscopes. They observed blood, urine, and other fluids in ways unimaginable to medieval physicians. Urine was no longer just a mystical window into the soul. Now it could be analyzed for sugar, protein, and other measurable substances. This was subtle, slow, and quiet. Not a revolution announced with fanfare, but a creeping, inevitable replacement of ritual with science. Doctors began taking notes, recording chemical properties rather than colors and sediments. The macula, once central, became an object of nostalgia and decoration. Its cultural authority slowly faded. Education transformed. Medical schools gradually shifted focus. Instead of hours spent swirling urine, students studied anatomy, physiology, and chemistry. Instead of memorizing 20 shades of yellow, they learned about the kidneys, bladder, and liver in detail. Still, traces of the old tradition persisted. Some universities kept a few uroscopy lessons as historical reference. And the visual literacy, learning to observe, note, and interpret subtle signs, remained valuable. In a sense, the medieval obsession with urine laid the groundwork for careful clinical observation. Even if the conclusions were often wrong, the discipline mattered. The cultural legacy. The cultural footprint of uroscopy is surprising. Art and literature. Doctors holding jars appear in paintings, engravings, and satire. Language, phrases like physician's judgment or macula in hand became faint echoes of past authority. Ritual. In some remote villages, ceremonial observation of bodily fluids persisted well into the 18th century. It's a reminder that human obsession, even with something as mundane as urine, can influence culture for centuries. Lessons from the macula. If we consider the life of a medieval doctor, a few quiet truths emerge. One observation mattered. Swirling, sniffing, and nodding colors trained careful attention to detail. 2. Ritual provided comfort. Patients felt cared for, even when the remedies were ineffective. 3. Confidence was central. Authority and performance mattered almost as much as skill. 4. Failure was common. Misdiagnoses, charlatans, and scandals were constants. In hindsight, these lessons are both humorous and human. Doctors did what they could with what they had, navigating superstition, societal expectation, and disease. Modern medicine's debt. Modern medicine may seem worlds apart. No one swirls pee for hours in a candlelit room, or diagnoses a king's melancholy from color alone. But observation, careful recording, and holistic attention to patients' symptoms are still central. In a way, the medieval physician's obsessive rituals were a distant ancestor of the modern clinical exam. Not the methods, but the underlying curiosity and persistence. The quiet fade of ritual. As chemistry, anatomy, and microbiology advanced, the macula lost relevance. Doctors no longer needed to rely on superstition. Remedies became evidence-based rather than ceremonial. Hospitals, labs, and textbooks replaced flasks and charms. The jars were stored away, eventually becoming museum curiosities. Some were displayed with a touch of irony, a reminder of how far medicine had come and how strange the past could be. Yet even as they faded, the rituals left behind a subtle imprint. The notion that careful observation, patient trust, and disciplined record-keeping matter. All born from the swirling, sniffing, mystical obsession with urine. Reflections on the human side. There's something quietly beautiful about this history. Medieval doctors worked in isolation, facing disease and superstition. Patients submitted to bizarre rituals, hoping for relief. Communities observed, recorded, and believed even in error. It's a story of hope, ritual, and the human desire to impose order on uncertainty. And while it involved a lot of yellow liquid, there's an almost poetic quality to the persistence, the attention to detail, and the social bonds that grew around these practices. A gentle reminder. As we close this long, slow journey, consider the pace and tone of life in medieval medicine. Slow observation, rituals took time as did learning. Attention to detail, every shade mattered, every sediment noted. Patient trust, even flawed methods offered comfort. Persistence, generations of doctors carried forward knowledge, ritual, and hope. All of this quietly contributed to what we now call modern medicine. A strange, humorous, and oddly human bridge from superstition to science. The final thought. So next time you sip water, pour tea, or even glance at a laboratory jar, remember the matula. Once it held the world of medicine in its glass walls. Once it shaped how humans thought about health, authority, and trust. And once it was central to the quiet, ritualized, and often absurd life of a medieval doctor. It faded slowly, almost reluctantly, replaced by microscopes and chemical tests. Yet its shadow lingers in our cultural imagination, a testament to centuries of observation, ritual, and the human desire to understand what is ultimately unknowable. And with that, we gently set down the matula. No swirls, no sniffing, no leeches, just quiet reflection on the strangely human story of medieval medicine. Thank you for floating through this long, slow, slightly absurd journey with me. May your dreams tonight be as calm, rhythmic, and vaguely yellow as a candle-lit matula in a quiet medieval study.